Should you put down your saw and grab a nibbler? Let's find out. Just a few weeks ago, we were at Milwaukee headquarters checking out everything they had new coming out, and this was kind of floating around. It really wasn't showcased. It really wasn't talked about. They'd already kind of talked about it, but they really didn't, make a big spectacle about it. But they did bring it out, and some people were using it on the set, if you will. And that was really our first time getting our hands on it, even though we didn't show any footage of it. Anyway, now we have it in our hands. It's the M12 FUEL Nibbler, and it's exactly what it says it is. It nibbles at metal. And if you need a tool like this, you probably already know what a nibbler is. There's been plug-ins or corded ones for quite some time, and there's been a couple or a few cordless companies that have also released cordless tools in this, but not like this one. So let's dive in, let's take a closer look, and as you can see, we'll actually use this on some different types of material, and then we'll come back and talk about what we think of it. We'll talk about pricing and about warranty. We've got the Milwaukee 2476, and as we mentioned, this is the M12 FUEL 16 gauge nibbler. Now we say 16 gauge because it will cut up to 16 gauge of mild steel. It will also do 18 gauge stainless steel and up to 12 gauge of aluminum. And for those of you that are working with AC duct, like spiral duct, it will do 22 gauge spiral duct, because in the spiral duct where you have the spiral going on, you've got multi sheets of metal intersecting there. So even though it's thinner gauge metal, it will still cut where those are doubled or tripled up, where the seam is. So this will cut the 22 gauge spiral ductwork without an issue. Now, it will also cut 12 gauge aluminum, which is pretty thick aluminum. It's almost getting there to 1/8 inch, which we'll show you cutting some of that here in a moment. Now, you have kind of this die and punch going on here where it's actually nibbling out the metal. So it's not like a saw that actually saws through the metal. It's actually doing nibbling, which it's named very well to be a nibbler. And you can tell that we've got a little wearing there because we have used this tool, and we'll show this in action here in a few moments. And right now it has a little short extension on here, but you can also get a longer extension. So if you need to get further away, so like standing seam stuff, sometimes those seams stand up quite a bit, or maybe you need to get in recessed areas, higher ribs, things like that. You can get an extension that extends that nibbler way out and gets it further away from the work. Now the M12 FUEL tells us we get a brushless motor on here, so we see the FUEL brushless designation. Have a very simple on-off switch, but in addition to the on-off switch, which by the way, this is a very quiet nibbler. In addition to the on-off switch, we also have a speed dial, and this speed dial we have 1 through 5, so we can slow this way down. But then we also have an auto mode, and the auto mode is really nice because you can set it in auto, and until it senses actually biting into something, it's going to stay pretty low. And we'll show you that even though we have it in auto, once we start cutting, it will ramp up and provide as much power as it thinks it needs to cut through the material you're cutting. So really like the auto mode. You may also just want to throw it on 5 and just let it eat fast all the time. That's fine as well. Get our typical M12 gauge there, where it tells us the battery status of how much juice is left in the battery right there on the tool. Now it says it'll also cut up to 7 feet per minute, which is pretty fast for a nibbler, and we know that we've got a lot of RPM going on in there. I'm not sure what the RPM is, but it should be able to cut through pretty quickly. Now, if we look here, we also get 2 LEDs that shine on our work, which is very useful, especially when you're cutting in dark areas or even on darker metals. If you've cut much metal at all, you're cutting white, you're cutting silver, things like that, you can easily see where you're cutting, but a lot of times when you get into those darker hues, it's kind of tough to see where you're actually cutting. So throwing some light on there is a great idea, and love to see that they're giving us 2 LEDs and one on either side, so that when you're turning or making your cuts, things like that, you're always going to have some light shining there. Now if you see something that sticks out here with this little wing nut, it's a really cool feature because we don't need any tools to make adjustments to this. Now, why would we want to make adjustments for this? Well, we're not always going to be cutting straight on. In fact, you probably have a favorite if you've ever used a nibbler, and quite honestly, once you do start using it, you will have a favorite way of how you like to cut, kind of using a circular saw. You may be right or left dominant. You may like to cut one way versus the other. This way, what we could do, and it may also depend on the situation you're in, I can loosen this up, and what happens is now I can move this die. So it's number one, it's indexed in 4 locations, so I can turn this every 90 degrees and lock this in. So I need no tools to actually re-index that cutting head or that die head and then be able to move that around very quickly, very easily, lock that back down, and now it's locked into place. I think you can also, you don't even have to be in one of the index locations. I can clamp that down and have that in between those index locations, but it will lock and index in every 90 degrees. Now, a different approach that Milwaukee took to this, rather than just taking an angle grinder and releasing a nibbler and changing the head, which a lot of the other cordless units out there are typically, looks like they're using the body of an angle grinder, which is a lot fatter. But going to the M12 design looks a lot like their die grinders and their smaller tools. Gives you a lot smaller handle, much more nimble tool here to be able to work around, and quite frankly, a quieter tool also. And the M12 platform provides plenty enough power for the cutting that we need to do, and we'll show you that here in a moment as well. Now let's talk about the cutting head here, and you'll see that this kind of acts like almost like a rudder on a boat. In other words, it's kind of steering you after the fact. And that's to help guide you kind of in a straight line and keep that metal separated and not, kind of folding back on itself or getting in the way. So that's going to aid in your cutting. Is it going to get in the way as you make tight circles? Yes, but not as much as you think. And again, we'll show you some pretty tight circles on some material here in a few moments. But like I mentioned, it will act as kind of a rudder, and you'll see it's not just flat metal. We've got some concave cut in there, so they make it as thin as possible with still holding rigidity for you to be able to make the cuts that you need. Now, one last thing before we measure and weigh this unit and then use it is this little bag right here. Now, when I see little bags on tools like this, like little handheld sanders and things, sometimes you can almost think, you know what, that's going straight in the trash. It is not going to be useful. That is not the case for this tool. This is an amazing addition to this tool, and I'm not trying to overstate that at all. But you'll see the little ring around here, and that's where this, again, toolless, that's where this bag is going to clamp onto and stay. And what this is going to do, it's going to catch all that shrapnel, all that material that you're cutting off of the metal, which, by the way, on a nibbler, it's making these little crescent moon shapes, looks like little bitty fingernails, if you will, and those can be sharp. And even though it's not like shards like you're cutting with a circular saw on thin metal, which again we'll show that in a moment as well, but this is catching all that debris, so whatever it's catching is not falling on your shop floor or not falling on the job site floor where you can step on and it works your way up, its way up through your shoe, or it gets in your dog's foot, or whatever, your dog eats it, your cat eats it. Anyway, my point is this bag is phenomenal, and we'll show you that at work here in one moment. Now quickly, as far as the length of this tool, I don't think it's really critical, but with the battery, you're looking at about 12.5 inches. The snout on this sticks down about 3 inches below the deck, which means really your cutting area is like 2 inches below this face here. And overall, that height is about 6.5 inches. Again, I don't think that's critical on this tool, and I think when it is, you'll go for an extension that kind of gets the tool away from your work anyway. Now, what I do think is important is the weight you're carrying around with a tool, and again, slimming this down to a 12-volt tool versus an 18 or 20-volt tool, I think is a smart choice. So even with a 4 amp hour battery, you're looking at less than 4 pounds of carrying weight. So 3 pounds, that's just over 3.5 pounds. So 3 pounds, 9.5 ounces is really a light tool to be doing the work that it's doing. Now let's go use this on a few things and see how it works. Now this is probably a very common use you would think of when you think of a nibbler, and that's kind of standing seam roofs or ribbed metal buildings, ribbed, roofing, you name it, common sheet metal use here. And the ability to have to go up and over these ribs is kind of a pain if you've got a pair of either manual snips or even, you know, some snips that maybe you put on a drill, or maybe you've got some dedicated snips. And even worse would be putting an abrasive blade on here. It's really not good. I'll show you some reasons why here in just one moment, as well as even a saw blade. Cold saw blade can still really cause some issues, and you can see some right here, and we'll show you a close-up of that here in a moment. But let's show the actual nibbler in action, and we've got the bag on here, and we'll start one way, and then I'm going to make a change as we get maybe about halfway through. I'm going to put it in the auto mode, turn it on, and you'll hear, once I start cutting, you'll hear it ramp up. Okay, maybe with all the metal racket, you're probably not hearing that ramp up. We'll show that here in a moment. But here's an issue where if I've got this straight on, now as I try to dip the tool, I've got to go below this metal. I've got to get into this sharp metal here, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's where I'd want to take this, loosen it up, make my turn on it, clamp it back down, and now I can get off to the side. And now I can make my way up and over. And you can also see how clean the cut is. And if you get a close up there, it literally looks like it's taking little nibbles out, which that's what it's doing. So I still should have cut-proof gloves on, but that's really not near as sharp as if I were cutting that with snips and you have those little jagged pieces you're leaving off, or even a circular saw where it leaves some nasty shark tooth bites, if you will. But this is leaving a lot smoother cut. And here's a situation where we maybe have a plumbing knockout or something that we need to take care of. You know, make a change to the cutting. Index the head. And this would be where I could either remove the bag or I could stick it through. Now, typically, you're probably not going to be able to do this if this is on a roof, obviously. But if you can, put the bag back on. So obviously in one way I have a lot more control than the other. I just couldn't seem to get with my left hand or my right hand to make that right hand sweeping turn. Turn the head around, and then I could easily make that left hand cut. That's just my motor skills and trying to get used to this tool and cutting one way better than the other. And again, just another point where you can index this head where you need it to make the cuts you need. And clean that up, and now let's see. So we made a couple of cuts here. So that's what would be all over the floor or all over your job site if we didn't have this little bag here catching all of those remnants. Now this is an example here of our metal, and this is actually from the building that we built. And this is where we had to rip this down this rib, and we used a standard circular saw with a basically a cold steel blade. But this is what you end up with. You end up with stuff like this. It cut pretty well, but still you have these jagged edges that, number one, cut really well, which is a bad thing. And it just leaves a nasty edge that you need to clean up, or you leave a nasty edge there. And that's one thing the nibbler is not doing. Now, in addition to what it's doing here, also what it's doing is on the surface of the metal, you can see here, is you take those little pieces that are being flung everywhere with the saw blade and they stick to the painted surface. Sometimes they're hot and they just instantly kind of impregnate themselves, and then they start rusting. And you see all these little rusty pieces. And this is where those metal fragments have landed and sat for a couple of years while this has been tucked away somewhere in our shop as we didn't need it yet. And you see exactly what happens. We've seen roofs failed because of this. So there's much more than just creating a sharp edge when using a blade. It can also cause failure down the road as well. Now let's cut some different metal. Now the metal we were cutting is typical when you get this ribbed sheeting or rib roofing. You can get either typically 26 or 29 gauge. This is the thicker 26 gauge. As you can see here, actually might even be 24 gauge. My 24 gauge won't even fit on there. I think it's 26 actually. Anyway, regardless, it's not the thinner 29 gauge metal, it's the 26. And this here should be 16 gauge. My little Miller Welders gauge here, let's see, 18 will not fit on there. Yeah, there's 16. So there's 16 gauge mild steel or galvanized steel. Let's see how well it cuts. Get the clean side here. So with that 16 gauge, that's about as tight of a radius as I can get with, as I was mentioning, kind of that rudder, if you will. Now the thinner gauge stuff you can kind of manipulate and probably make a little tighter circle, but I just wanted to show that. But as far as cutting that thicker 16 gauge steel, that's not a problem. Now let's bring in here some 12 gauge aluminum. I'm going to take my bag off because I'm going to use it to open up this square tubing here. I believe this was some banister from a porch we did or something. Now you'll see when I was getting hung up, basically this was getting hung up on the inside of that tube there. But as far as being able to cut this stuff, no problem at all. In fact, I'm going to try to rip through this. I think this is 3 feet, almost as fast as possible. I'm going to leave it on auto. You know what? Let's leave it on 5. And you see here, this is not 14 gauge, so it's probably 12 gauge. It's not quite an 1/8 inch. I think 1/8 inch is usually 11 gauge, and so that's got to be 12 gauge aluminum right there. And you can see again how nice the cut is on it, or keeping it from being really jagged sharp. Again, I wouldn't recommend to run your finger down it, but it just looks like little nibbles out of it, as you can see right here. This thing works great, and I think it works better than any of the other cordless ones that are out there, just being absolutely honest with you. And the other ones are a lot bulkier because, as I was mentioning, they're based on kind of that angle grinder platform, so they're a lot bulkier through the handle. It's like you're holding an angle grinder. And something like a nibbler, you want it to be a little more nimble so that you can make the cuts where you need to cut and make some different angles and things like that. But the Autobody guy is going to love something like this in those situations where you're cutting rocker panels off of pickup trucks. You know, those rusty rocker panels, and you're not throwing sparks across the shop with a carbide wheel, but you'll be able to make some cuts that normally you're having to use a carbide wheel or a little metal jigsaw or something like that. Now this nibbler is going to make it a lot easier to get in those places, as well as leave a better surface once you're done with it. Now again, you'll still need those other tools. You're never going to replace a zip wheel, I don't think. But this nibbler is going to make it quite easily. You metal roof guys, metal building guys that are constantly using their ribbed metal and standing seam metal, things like that, you absolutely know the benefits of a tool like this. And having it cordless and light is going to be a huge benefit. Everything we cut on this single battery. I think we've got 2 bars or kind of half the battery left on it. But again, everything we cut in this was done on this single battery here. So you're going to get a lot of run time. It's not as fast as taking a circular saw and ripping down a sheet of metal, but I don't think you'd expect that. But it moves along rather quickly. And the more you kind of understand how it moves, the better off you'll be at making those turns. You won't look as stupid as I was when we first made our first circle. But great idea. Milwaukee did a great job of refining the features on this. I think they've been working on this a couple of years now. But anyway, great tool. Love the LED lights on the front. Love the non-tool needed to index the cutting tip or the die, if you will. Also remember that you can extend this as well. You can get an extension kit, and I believe they have a punch kit coming out as well. Price on this is $229 for the bare tool. Kind of expensive for a bare M12 tool, but again, something you need. If this is the type of tool you need, then you know the value in it. It's probably going to make your money back rather quickly. If you want to get a kit, I think you can get it for like $320 with a 4 amp hour battery without a charger, and then there may be another kit with a charger like in the $350 range or $360 range. We'll have links in the description where you can see all of that. So make sure you check it out. 5-year warranty on this, as with most of your M12, M18 fuel stuff. So again, check it out from Milwaukee. It's the 2476 and it's the 16 gauge nibbler. We had no problem cutting the thickness of steel that they mentioned, or even the aluminum as well. Hey, keep track of us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and even TikTok. And if you don't mind, would you hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't done so already? And by all means, as always, if you hated our video, then give us a thumbs down. But would you let us know in the comments why? Have a great day and keep smiling.